Hi folks, I'm Howard Jones, and today we're here in my studio where I'm going to be showing you what tools and materials I use on a regular basis. These tools that I've been using for probably 10 years plus, and brushes, palettes, paints, etc. And I've changed a few times. I've changed the brushes a few times. I've changed my palette a few times, and I'll explain all that in detail, the reasons why I changed. So the reason perhaps for you watching this is that maybe you haven't painted in the loose style before in watercolour, or you may even be a starter in watercolour painting, or you're just curious. Maybe you've seen me working on my videos and wonder perhaps what I use and how I use them. So that's what this is all about. For whatever reason you are watching this, you're very welcome. And so I'm going to crack on, and probably I think we'll start with talking about my palette. So before we begin, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, and if you want immediate notifications as and when I upload new videos, then do please remember to click on the bell icon. So let's look at the palette. This is a palette I've been using for a couple of years. It's made by a company I believe are called Artist Palettes, appropriately enough. I bought two at the time. I have one left. No idea what happened to the other one. But it's basically, I think that the company Holbein make a very similar, if not identical, palette to this, and I find it very useful. It has 20 colour wells, but I use mainly just 9, and the way I lay my colours out in here are cool on one side and warm on the other. Another reason why I like this palette is because of the mixing area. It has the lid itself. Let me just show you again. So when it's closed, it's about 12 by 6, and I keep that kitchen sponge, a damp kitchen sponge, in here, and that keeps all my paints workable. They're tube paints. I always squeeze fresh paint into these wells prior to starting a painting, and when I'm finished, the damp sponge goes back in and the lid gets closed, and those paints will remain workable for at least a week, probably longer. You've got to be a little bit careful. If you leave it in there longer than that, there's a chance that you might get some fungus actually growing on the paints. But yeah, great palette. The reason why I like it again is because I have these separate mixing areas. So I might mix up a cool small wash in there, and a warm small wash in here, and use the lid for the really big washes, like the starting of the sky or something like that. So yeah, those are I think excellent palettes. In the past, I've used other palettes, nearly always lidded palettes, when I realised the importance of a lidded palette for keeping paints fresh. And there are other benefits too. Sometimes, when you've got a number of colour wells, and you keep those colour wells, so you keep the colours in those colour wells in the same place, rather than just sort of swap them around willy-nilly. If you keep them in the same place, you get this sort of visual reminder as to where your colours are. I have used plates. This is just a camping plate, just an enamel camping plate, and you can buy them really cheaply from outdoor stores, camping stores. I think they're fantastic, and the times that I would use something like this, because obviously it's not lidded, but I would use this when I'm experimenting. Perhaps I want to use a colour that I don't want to put in my palette, and I'd squirt out a bit of fresh paint on the edge of the plate here, and do all my mixing in the central area. But it's so important. The two main things for I think a loose style watercolorist in terms of palette is to have fresh paint and have large mixing areas and a lid on that palette. So there's the palettes. Let's have a look at the paints that I use on a regular basis. Now, I would always put these two first. It's ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. One cool, one warm. And I've painted many a painting with just those two colours. I don't go anywhere without those two colours. So in addition to these, I'll go through the blues first. I have cerulean blue. I use cobalt blue. And to a lesser extent, I will use phthalo blue and indigo. So there's 5 blues there, but really, if anything, it's probably those 3 there that I use mostly, but they will be kept in neighbouring wells. So all my blues are side by side in my palette. And then moving towards the warm colours, we've already mentioned the burnt sienna. I would also use, let's get that out the way a minute, I'd also use raw sienna, so it's burnt sienna, raw sienna. And then I play around with my yellows a fair bit, but I've nearly always got cadmium yellow pale in my palette. It's pretty reliable, but you will see me use other yellows like quinacridone gold, Indian yellow, gamboge, and a couple of others. But you're looking at there, this is my regular palette. And in addition to this, in my regular palette, my red is cadmium scarlet. That is a warm opaque red. And then a cool transparent red, alizarin crimson. And then moving on, we have neutral tint, which is a transparent, as the name suggests, neutral grey. I find that very useful. Sometimes when you're making a mix and for whatever reason you want to darken it very quickly and you can't go through the time and trouble of looking for that dark mix, and the neutral tint, a bit of neutral tint in the mix will get you out of a scrape. So then finally in my regular palette I will always have a tube of either Chinese white, or it's usually white gouache, to be perfectly honest. I prefer white gouache to Chinese white. And then I will play around with other colours, things like I have brilliant violet here, cobalt green, I will use cobalt turquoise, but I sort of consider those to be sort of spur of the moment colours. These are my workhorse sort of selection here. So let's look at the brushes. So we've had a look at the palette. You've seen the paints that I use on a regular basis. Let's look at the brushes. And the sort of brushes need a bit of a special mention because I have changed my choice of brushes over the years, and I really only use 5, and I'll show you what they are. It's this 5 here, but I'll show you a few others because you might want to sort of dabble with some options yourselves. This is a mop. This is a big mop used for washes and shape making actually. It comes to a really good point when it's fully loaded, and it holds a lot of paint and a lot of water. So big areas, large areas of your painting can be done very quickly. It takes a bit of getting used to because it does work. You have to really sort of start with a fully loaded brush most of the time and then let it run through its various stages to get other effects. Starting with my biggest brushes, that's the big mop. In my right hand, in this hand here, is my flat, and that's a sort of shape making brush for geometric shapes. And I might favour this one sometimes when I'm painting cityscapes and buildings, things like that. Again, it holds quite a bit of paint, but strictly speaking, it's not a wash brush where that one is. If, however, you are working on a small piece of paper, and by small I mean 15 by 11 or smaller, then that brush can serve as a wash brush as well. And then the smaller brushes, so those are that's a large round and a large flat. I will go larger than that sometimes if I'm working on bigger paper. Next in line are 2 round brushes, a size 7 round with a good point and a size 4 round for handling those details, those smaller details. Particularly when you get, to sort of putting in perhaps windows and doors in buildings and figures and things like this. Those come in really handy. There's nothing special about them. The only thing I would recommend when you're buying your round brushes is that you buy a brush that has a very good point. And this is a dry brush, but when wet you'll see that comes to a really good fine point. That can be really useful. So yep, 2 round brushes, and this is a rigger brush, this chap here. It does lines, it makes fantastic lines, and as the name suggests, it was originally designed, or it was used a lot by people who used to paint marine scenes with boats, hence the name rigging brush, from the lines they would be painting of the rigging on these boats, on these old boats. Great brush, fantastic for line work. So those are my 5 most important brushes. Now, if you're like me, I probably own just about every brush that's been designed and made. I think the manufacturers probably love people like me. Having said that, when I look back, I probably don't use... I must have in excess of well over 150 brushes, something like that, and I may use some of them, but only because they're replicas of what I've already got in front of you here. So, but I'm going to mention 1 or 2 others that I think you should consider, just because I only use these mainly. I actually do use others, and I'm going to show you them now for your consideration. So let's get the workhorse brushes out the way for a moment and look at some of these others. I mentioned a wash brush. I mentioned that this you need a brush for painting large washes. This is a great option. This is called a Hokey Brush. It's I think we call it a Hake brush, H-A-K-E, but I believe it's I think it originated probably in China, and I think it's pronounced Hokey Brush. It's goat hair. It's a wash brush mostly, and it holds a lot of paint and water. I go in and out of favour with this brush. One of the things that you've got to be careful of is when you've made a pass with a loaded brush, this brush will tend to sort of stay bent a little bit like that. It's springing back now because it's dry, but when it's wet and loaded with paint, it doesn't reform very easily. It doesn't have much spring in it, and 2 of the main qualities of any paintbrush are holding capacity, that is the amount of paint and water it can hold, and spring. I don't get on terribly well with brushes that don't spring back to shape. It's to do with areas of my painting. Sometimes I paint quite rapidly, and that holds me up. But it is a good brush, and if I'm painting something where speed isn't so important, then that's a fantastic brush. Then we've got something called a sword liner, which you can have great fun with. I'll do another video soon on the use of brushes and brush work rather, because of course, as fancy as they may look, this great name, isn't it, sword liner brush, and it looks exactly like that. It looks like a sword. As fancy as they appear, it's the only good brush mark comes from you. Brushes don't actually make the marks. So, but having said that, when you've got something like this in your hand, it does encourage you. It certainly encourages you to experiment more. You can get fine lines. In a sense, this brush can do a couple of jobs. It can do a fine line like the rigger brush I showed you a moment ago, when it's fully loaded, you'll get a fine line from it. But you can also get beautiful leaf-like shapes. It's all about contact, pressure, and direction. And I'll do more on that in another video. So the sword liner is definitely worth a consideration. It's a great brush. It's a fantastic brush. And then these two here are my really cheap brushes. I think they're like sort of school brushes, ponytail hair, something like that. And you can see where I've taken them outside on a piece of stone or concrete. Move that one wants to play. Where I've hammered them with I've smashed the end of the fibres with a hammer just to create a very random edge to these. And when they're wet and carrying paint, they make fantastic brushes for very loose looking, impressionistic looking trees. They're really, really cheap. I think if you can pop into your local art store and catch them at the right time, these things end up in the bargain baskets, bargain tubs for 50p, half a dollar, or something like that. So really, those are my brushes. Those 5 there, the ones I would highly recommend as your sort of starting kit, if you like. Excellent brushes. And these are also, another wash brush here, slightly smaller than the Hokey brush. But the best tip I can give you here is, if you are going to invest in particularly the larger brushes like these, if you're treating yourself to a brush like this, you must stick with it for, I would say, if you paint once a week, and maybe that's 2 hours, 3 hours a week, you should stick with the single brush for at least 2 months. Just to get used to it, because that's where I made the mistake many years ago. I was a bit sort of, I'd buy it, I'd pick it up, and I didn't understand it, didn't know how I should have been using it, because they are all very different. And I'd give up on it, and it would be cast aside until, I knew better. I wish somebody had said to me, you need to stick with one brush for as long as possible, and it will feel awkward in the beginning. So stick with it before you move on to another brush. The choice is yours whether you start with something like that and stick with that or that. I mean, you could do both side by side as long as you keep them both going. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Stick with the brush. Buy a good brush and stick with it. Get to know that brush. What else should we have here? Let's have a look at paper. So this is a piece of 15 by 11 Saunders 140 pound weight, not surface, NOT surface, which is a medium texture surface. So I would avoid hot press paper for the loose style watercolorist. I would definitely go rough, and I do use rough paper. So if you're looking at the 3 main surfaces, you have smooth or hot pressed as it's known. You have this, which is cold pressed, or also known as NOT, N-O-T. And then you have rough paper. But you won't go far wrong with NOT, not paper, 140 pound Saunders. There are other wonderful papers out there. Many of them I also like myself. Arches, Moulin de Roy, Canson, Hahnemuhle make fantastic watercolour papers. I do use Bockingford too, quite a bit actually, but it is the cheaper end of the watercolour paper. But it's certainly a lot better than some of these practice papers that you can buy. I try to sort of steer people away from practice papers. If they're badly sized or something like that, and you keep working on those and you're not getting much progress, you start blaming yourself, I think, and it's often poor paper. And I must say that about paints too. Try to buy the best quality watercolour paints that your budget will allow. things like Winsor & Newton, artist quality. Try to avoid anything with the student label on it. There are quite a few poor paints out there, and for the same reasons: bad paper, bad paint. You know, if it's a hard enough game as it is, I think you've got to try to do yourself. You know, keep yourself recognizing that you're moving forward, because if you keep getting bad results, it might not necessarily be what you're doing. It could be down to your materials. So that's my paper. That's one of my favourite papers, if not my favourite paper. So it's the paper. What else should we look at here? Water tub. Now you might think this is a pretty unimportant. This is a very dirty water tub, by the way, but it does get used a lot. It's been used today. Water tub. You could just think, well, why don't I just use a jam jar? And I strongly advise you to avoid tall receptacles, jam jars, drinking glasses, anything like that, because I've seen so many paintings, including my own in the early days, spoilt because you're reaching over to get water, or you're reaching over the water to get something else, and the whole lot floods the table, including your painting. So something nice and flat. This is a shop bought one, but you know, a really good water tub is something like one of these family size ice cream tubs, and you have the pleasure of eating it in the first place, and once it's empty, it makes a fantastic water receptacle for because it's flat. You know, you're not going to knock it over, and it holds a lot. And again, size is important. If you're painting on this size paper, you don't want a little jam jar of a thing or a little cup here. It should hold a good litre and possibly more of water. So what else should we have a look at here? I always have a bit of old rag here, because when you're painting, sometimes, you know, you get mucky hands, and it's much quicker just to sort of run a brush over a piece of cloth like that, just to get so you can make quick colour changes and things like that. This is essential. This is kitchen roll. Tissues, kitchen roll, doesn't matter which you use, but they are essential just for quickly cleaning brushes, etc. Again, let's have a look at pencil and paper. I use an array of pencils. This is a self-propelling pencil. It's really up to you on this. The only thing I would say to avoid is using a pencil sharpener, like an office pencil sharpener, because you don't want a really pointy, hard pencil. So you need to be looking at a 2B or a 3B in the first place. Pencil sharpeners give you a very short point, actually, and a very pointy, a very sharp point and a very short point. And that can actually damage your paper, especially if you're going to the harder leads like the 2H pencils and things like that. So a good softish lead and a craft knife. So I only ever sharpen my pencils with a craft knife. You can also get quite a chisel sort of shape to the end of that pencil too, then, which gives you a variation of line, type of line you can make with it, which is very important. But the propelling pencil is very useful, very convenient. Again, you know, it's slightly more limited perhaps than the natural lead pencil, because it is of a single diameter. But any pencil, as long as it's not too hard and you avoid pencil sharpeners to keep them going. Eraser, another recommendation here. So I would include the craft knife. You need a good craft knife in your kit bag. The eraser, avoid plastic rubbers, plastic erasers. They will just make a horrible mess on your watercolour paper. So buy yourself, they're not expensive, buy yourself a good putty eraser, something like this. And although this looks rather tacky and mucky, it's actually a very good eraser, and still works, and I've been using this one literally for years. And don't be put off by the fact that it is mucky, because the muck on the eraser amazingly doesn't come off on the paper. It just keeps working. Fantastic. Essential little bit of kit. Then we need masking tape. Let's move on to what we actually need for the paper itself. So I use a piece of MDF board, but you can use any board as long as it's fairly rigid. A piece of cardboard is not going to do, because it will warp and it'll get quite, it'll get too awkward to work on. So you can work on the flat, but you can also, if you want, prop that board up with something like this. This is just a piece of wedged wood, and that gives me something like a 30-degree angle off the flat of the table surface, because you will need a bit of an angle on that paper so that your washes come down to a bead. So you'll need masking tape to fix your paper to your board. Okay, if you can, I would probably put a couple of coats of varnish on this board, because in time, if you've soaked that board a lot from your washes, it will go horribly uneven underneath. So a couple of coats of varnish usually sort that out. But I tape masking tape all the way around 4 sides. I don't pre-stretch my paper with brown gum tape. I don't get the time. It is good if you can. If you get the time to pre-stretch your paper, it is quite nice to paint on pre-stretched paper. But not essential. You get used to working this way. You do get some buckling in the paper and some cockling in the paper, but you get used to working with it. Okay. I think there's only a couple of other things really I need to mention to you, and that is things for making marks. And I have a couple of items, a bit of scraping out, texture making items. One is just a bit of old credit card cut into quarter or half, and when that's not to hand, I'll often use just a palette knife like this, where I'm scraping into my wet paint. So though that's the basic kit. In addition to that, optional extras, it's worth buying yourself a mount. Most online stores now will sell a mount. It's quite nice when you've come to the end of your painting to place a mount around your hard work. If you can see your painting isolated with this lovely sort of neat shape around it, it really shows off, enables you to see the painting for what it is, because with all the sort of paraphernalia around you when you're painting, you forget to sort of, it needs encapsulating, if you like, within this sort of framework, and for you not to be put off by what's around it. So that's quite a handy bit of kit. Easels. If you're planning on standing up and painting, then an easel is absolutely essential. And you can pick them up from most stores now for about £30, 30 British pounds. I think that's probably about $40, $45, something like that. Very useful if you're wanting to stand up and paint. I use a product called Frank Herring easel, versatile easel, made by Frank Herring and Son here in the UK, and that is just a fantastic easel, particularly for working outdoors, because it's so lightweight. It's made of tubular aluminium, and will basically form any shape you desire, whether it's stood up at an angle, stood up vertical, even sat down. You can fold it at half its height and be sat down working off that easel. So that's a very good easel. Other than that, really, it's a case of brushing up on the technical skills and and practice, practice, practice. So I hope you found this visit to my studio quite useful, and and you perhaps might want to consider using some of these things yourselves. And as I always say, these things work for me, and I have had the time to sort of make educated decisions on a lot of those things, particularly the paints and the brushes. But you sort of need to do that yourselves too. So good luck with everything, and I'll see you at the next session.